Hi, this is Paul. Sorry for the shorter videos. I have limited bandwidth here, and my sister and mother are flying into Grand Rapids. That's part of the reason I'm staying a few extra days to do some family visiting. They're flying out here to visit some of our other extended family here, so I'll be here for a few days, so don't really have time or bandwidth to do big, long videos, so I'm going to make them and post them as I do them. Something that I sort of wanted to do during Synod, but because of the embargo and just how busy Synod keeps you, it's really hard to do that. I want to talk about the politics of this a little bit within the Christian Reformed Church. There were a couple of protests the evening that the decision was made. Some protesters came out with rainbow flags. This person right here is Keith Manis. He was in school with me. I have other friends, old roommates, a lot of Calvin faculty. I know the security staff here pretty well because I worked with them. Some other Calvin faculty were here, other members of the Christian Reformed Church. They were waving the rainbow flags. One of the things that Synod did was close the gallery during these proceedings, which I think I'll talk about when I talk about the embargo on this, because that's a whole nother separate area. Then after the Christian Reformed made the decision, they had another little protest where everyone wore black and either had black face masks on or rainbow face masks on. And these obviously represent the progressives in the Christian Reformed Church. For them, this decision is an absolute catastrophe because I think most progressives in the CRC have been living in denial about the nature of their own denomination. I think part of that is because a certain amount of CRC progressives are here in the West Michigan area, and the Christian Reformed Church in West Michigan is different from the Christian Reformed Church just about every place else. That doesn't mean that there aren't other progressive Christian Reformed churches in other places in the United States and in Canada especially, but the dynamics are different. One of the things that is happening in the Christian Reformed Church is that Christian Reformed churches are struggling in urban areas and often thriving in rural or agricultural areas. And this has been happening for the last 30 years. Christian Reformed churches in the New Jersey area where I grew up are a fraction of what they were when I was growing up. Same for Christian Reformed churches in the San Francisco Bay community, while churches in the Central Valley in California, especially in the agricultural towns in the Central Valley, are doing fairly well. Same is true in Los Angeles to a degree. Christian Reformed churches in Los Angeles are often struggling. I'm speaking mostly about the majority culture Christian Reformed churches. There's a Chinese Christian Reformed church in the Bay Area that is thriving, the Golden Gate Church. There are Korean churches in Southern California that are thriving, but the majority culture Christian Reformed community, often made up of the descendants of Dutch immigrants, are passing away in many of these areas. The churches are shriveling and dying and going away. Now, one of the things that is evident by listening to the discussions on the floor of Synod is that I think many CRC progressives imagined that this movement would be analogous to the women in office fights in the early 90s. By 1995, the Christian Reformed Church had had enough of fighting over the issue of women in ordained office. The votes had gone back and forth in different synods. Finally, in 1995, they reached a settlement where individual congregations could ordain women clergy, women deacons, women elders, women ministers. This is the 25th anniversary of that decision, and the 25th anniversary was celebrated now, even though, of course, it was 2020, but there was no Synod in 2020. There was a presentation given on the floor of Synod where some statistics were noted. I should probably find it. This slide in the presentation showing that 72% of churches in the Christian Reformed Church will allow a woman to serve as deacon, and 52% of churches in the Christian Reformed Church will allow women to serve as elder. Now, after 25 years, that number is only just a bit above 50%. I think that is a disappointment to a lot of progressives in the denomination, but I think that they have felt that given enough time, the numbers are only going to go in one direction. I don't think that's true. They had another chart breaking down women in active ordained ministry. 23% of the women in the CRC in active ordained ministry are lead or solo pastors. 34% are pastors, basically assistant pastors or pastors of other things. 20% are chaplains. That's a huge number compared to, let's say, the way that men are serving. And this is the number of women ordained as ministers of the word in the Christian and commissioned pastors, both in the Christian Reformed Church. And the number has risen to 66. Now, depending on, I don't know whether you think that's a large number or a small number, but there are somewhere close to 1,100 churches in the Christian Reformed Church. Not all of them have ministers of the word or commissioned pastors, but the vast majority of them do, which means that women are a tiny fraction of the ordained leadership in the Christian Reformed Church. I think a lot of CRC progressives believe that the question about same-sex marriage is simply going to follow the same trajectory as women's ordination. That isn't true. When women's ordination passed, those who were in favor of it very much said this is a very different subject from same-sex marriage. Now, many who are advocating same-sex marriage, basically, and you can find multiple speeches on the floor of Synod, basically people tying together these points. The votes on recommending the human sexuality report was, let me find it, 131 yes and 45 no. The votes on making the Heidelberg Catechism question and answer 108 interpreted as homosexual sex, among other things, was 123 yes, 53 no to abstaining. Those are huge margins. CRC progressive churches are now in a real bind, and they're going to have to figure out a path forward, and it isn't going to be easy. The church in question, Neland Avenue in Grand Rapids, Michigan, they basically were censured in a certain way. I'll explain that. Again, with similarly large votes, the Synod instructs Neland Avenue CRC to immediately rescind its decision to ordain a deacon in same-sex marriage, thus nullifying this deacon's current term. That Synod instruct Neland Avenue CRC to uphold our shared denominational conventions and procedures as laid out in the church order and the covenant for office bearers. That Synod instruct the executive director to appoint a committee in loco, basically a local committee, to meet with the Neland Avenue CRC to oversee its compliance to Synod's rulings, to meet with Classis Grand Rapids East to admonish them regarding their responsibility to uphold our shared denominational covenants and procedures as laid out in the church order and the covenant of office bearers, to report to the meeting of Classis Grand Rapids East in the autumn meeting, September 15, 2022, and make pertinent recommendations for its deliberations and actions, if necessary, to invite 3 other classes to assist the committee in dealing with the issues regarding Neland Avenue CRC, to report to Synod 2023 by way of the printed agenda of its actions and any classical actions taken and present its recommendations. Okay, so what are the options? Well, obviously to basically rescind its decision to ordain the deacon and nullify the deacon's current term. Will they do that? Well, we will have to see. That Synod send these people to these meetings to see whether or not they comply. Okay, What are the options left for these churches in the Christian Reformed Church? The CRCNA has a website called The Network that has articles pertaining to the Christian Reformed Church, and this was a report written by Dan Winaski about an all-one-body meeting in 2018. On Thursday evening, November 8, I attended an event at Sherman Street Christian Reformed Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The event was hosted by All One Body. All One Body is an organized, highly motivated group of CRC members, pastors, and office bearers whose stated goal is to transform the CRC into a denomination that fully accepts and celebrates the value of LGBTQ+ movement. All One Body wants the CRC to normalize and celebrate homosexual activity, bisexual activity, and transgender identity in a fully inclusive environment. I have never been to Sherman Street CRC before. When I arrived at church, the night had fully arrived. Even though it was only 7:45 in the evening, the parking lot was full. I drove around the building, but there were so many vehicles that many people had already invented parking spots where no legitimate park existed. The sanctuary of the church was packed with 200 people or more. As the event had begun, I quietly took a seat about halfway up on the left side of the sanctuary. As the event went on, it became clear that everyone in the audience, save me and one other, were enthusiastic supporters of the agenda. The main speaker for this event was Jim Lucas, a former CRC minister who currently works for the United Church of Christ, a denomination that already affirms the beliefs and ideas that LGBTQ+ movement. Jim Lucas spoke, 5 other people with connections to the CRC, a board member of All One Body, a CRC pastor's wife, a CRC pastor who's not currently serving in a pastor's role, a retired Christian school teacher, and a former CRC member who is now a UCC chaplain were brought on stage to join in a discussion that focused mainly on the best strategy for turning the CRC into a denomination that celebrates the values of homosexual and transgender ideology. What was that future? One of the speakers made an assertion that I'm disappointed to say, that's the writer of the article saying this, I agree with. He stated that the current crop of young people in society at large and in the CRC in general are completely on board with the idea that homosexual behavior is something to celebrate. He stated that it is merely a matter of time until the defenses of the CRC and other denominations like her crumble against the persistent battery of the LGBTQ+ movement. The problem for the speaker is that he, and most everyone who believes as he does, is not patient enough to wait for a new generation of leaders to rise up, friendly to the demands for inclusion, acceptance, and celebration. They want to move much more quickly. To this end, one of the board members of All One B gave the audience a piece of advice. Do not use Scripture to convince your fellow CRC members of the beauty of full inclusion. Instead, rely on personal stories. Everyone has a story, she said. We can argue back and forth all day about Scripture, but we're never going to win that way. Nobody can argue with your story. Another member of the panel shared the focus of this personal story strategy, and he said that it is all about convincing people through stories about real people who have embraced the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender lifestyle, that such people bear healthier fruit than those who are non-inclusive. Whereas the panel referred to the old teaching of the church as toxic, All One Body wants the CRC as a whole to accept the new teachings of full inclusion yielding good fruit. The panel members made it clear that the relative health and goodness of the fruit is completely dependent on how a person feels about himself, herself, zerself, or whatever gender pronoun the person identifies with. When the person feels people, when the church tells people that their personal lifestyle is sinful and destructive, people will feel very bad about it. But if the church will affirm everyone's lifestyle choice, then people will feel wonderful. That's the good fruit. According to the panel members, the power of personal stories is magnified immensely when LGBTQ+ lifestyle hits close to home. A son, daughter, grandchild, niece, nephew, child of a close friend who personally claims one of the letters is enough to break down even the strongest defenses. The people on stage at Sherman Street were emphatic about the need to use real-life personal examples to win people over. This was a main focus on the pre-synod attempts to basically move synod in a particular direction. Prior to Synod, the Hesed Project was created and promoted as something that synodical delegates should watch in order so that they could hear the stories. One of the big points of those against the human sexuality report was that it didn't include any stories of same-sex couples who were, living fruitful lives or living sick. Usually the phrase that is used is well-adjusted. So this clearly was the strategy used, hopefully, to, let's say, make progress at this synod, or at least prevent what actually happened. Back to the 2018 meeting of All One Body. The panel and members recognized that the legislative approach of sending an overture to synod was not likely to turn the CRC into an all-inclusive ally of the LGBTQ plus promoters. They also exhibited pessimism that the 2021 Synodical Report on Human Sexuality will move the CRC closer to their desired outcome. Because of this, the panel revealed their preference for a strategy of using judicial rulings similar to the way the secular activists won the case at the Supreme Court with Obergefell. All One Body's plan to transform the CRC will proceed as follows. They will identify a current CRC pastor who is sympathetic to their cause, who is willing to perform a homosexual wedding ceremony. There was a Calvin faculty member that in fact did that. Or taking another route, they will find a CRC congregation that is willing to elect an elder or a deacon who is openly and proudly living a homosexual partnership. Inevitably, this will cause a firestorm of protest in the CRC. Complaints will be filed, debate will ensue, the banner will publish articles for and against, the great brouhaha will eventually make its way to Synod. And that is, of course, what happened. Of course, there was a pandemic along the way. Now, I should note, in fairness to Neland Avenue, that in speaking with Larry Louders, who was the elder at Synod, who I was very impressed with, I thought he handled himself perfectly at Synod in a very difficult position. He was patient, he was a listener, he was affable, he was engaging. I was very impressed with Larry, and I'd probably like to have him on the channel sometime, have a conversation with him. And also Len Vander Zee, my friend who has been on the channel a number of times. I have to keep moving my hand so the room light doesn't turn off. Both of them had said to me that the decision that Neland took, even though many suspect that it was conveniently timed to push this issue when it did, that in many ways the dominant tensions were local. In the letter that Neland had sent, they themselves said that 40% of the congregation was affirming, 40% of the congregation was traditional, and 20% was flexible, and so that basically pushed them over the edge. This individual had served well as a deacon before. She was in this married relationship, and they needed and wanted her to serve again. So in other words, and I trust when everything that I've seen of Larry and very much of Len, who I've known for a number of years and have been a friend with, these people aren't going to lie to me about this. And so I don't think that Neland's case was necessarily to be a proof case, but in some ways it turned out to be almost a perfect proof case. And the hope on the part of All One Body is that synodical delegates will embrace the path of least resistance and rule to favor in the pastor or the church or the office bearer. Synod might decide, as it had been done with other controversial issues, that the LGBTQ plus question is a matter of each local church to decide, council to decide. Or if the personal story of the individual involved is especially powerful, Synod may embrace empathy as the path towards inclusion. Perhaps a desire to move the CRC's relevancy credentials will convince Synod to get with the times. Well, that didn't happen, and it didn't happen in a huge way. The Human Sexuality Report, the way the committee was founded, should have communicated clearly to CRC progressives that this was not unfolding like women in office. It has been 6 years since that report was mandated, and the votes for that report And then for understanding Heidelberg Catechism 108 as confessional, I explained that in the previous video, and for basically working towards disciplining Neland Avenue and Classis Grand Rapids East, those votes too were overwhelming. The video of today's proceedings are not yet up. Maybe I'll revisit this in a subsequent video. Larry Lauder gave quite a moving speech where he said that he thought he could go to this synod and talk to people and sway votes. He basically went in there with the assumption of what all one body had imagined would be the way forward. And what he discovered was that the cake was baked. The votes were set. Now, part of what amazes me about this is that CRC progressives imagine that at this point, now I'll use a time example, at this point in 2022, there are many of us out there who don't have gay and lesbian friends, gay and lesbian relatives, gay and lesbian children that haven't been impacted by this kind of storytelling. The most powerful influence machine in all of human history, American corporate commercial media, has been promoting this for years now. To think that some new stories are just going to turn the people en masse is really naive. What these votes mean is that progressives in the CRC no longer have a strategy. They imagine that very quickly in evolution of the movement, that with each successive synod, their influence will grow. I don't think so. I've stated many times that I don't think the Christian Reformed Church is ever going to go affirming. I think the Christian Reformed Church would die before it goes affirming. I think that's probably a greater threat to it than if you believe the Christian Reformed Church should never go affirming, that it would go in that direction. Why? Number one, the RCA. What's happening in the Christian Reformed Church and what happened in the RCA is these majority culture churches made up of Dutch immigrants have quickly realized that their only strategy for institutional preservation and growth is evangelism and enfolding often ethnic minority churches and leaders wholesale. The RCA did that. It changed the complexity of their denomination, which forced the confrontation with the mainline RCA East that has brought on the rupture that she is currently in. In the Christian Reformed Church, similarly, almost all of the people that stood up, not all, I can think of one, but almost all of the people that stood up and passionately argued for LGBTQ plus inclusion were white. The members of Synod who were Asian, Hispanic, Navajo, the Navajo didn't say much, African Americans, fundamentally, primarily, are conservative. And if the Christian Reformed Church is going to grow at all, it will likely grow more conservative. Second point, unlike the RCA, a big element in the Christian Reformed Church are its day schools. As in the demographic video that I played in a previous video, as Christian Reformed families get smaller, those institutions preserve themselves by becoming alternative institutions to the public school. What that means is that increasingly, Christian Reformed institutions are going to be bringing in conservative teachers and conservative students. With this decision, that will likely happen with Calvin University as well. With this decision, the faculty of Calvin University will likely become increasingly conservative. That, too, is going to make the church more conservative. Reason number 3, as I mentioned before, Christian Reformed churches in very blue urban areas, in terms of majority culture populations, are in severe decline. Christian Reformed churches now this is mostly the U.S., Canada I think is a little different, but I don't know it. In the Christian Reformed Church, churches in rural communities and in agricultural communities tend to be doing a lot better. In other words, the composition of the church will likely continue to get more conservative. As polarization increases in the country overall, you see on both sides of the debate increasing alignment with, let's say, the political polls, the rhetoric that's used, the ideas that are out there. The Christian Reformed Church, is going to continue to get more and more conservative. This strategy that has been the implicit strategy by CRC progressives simply won't work. They should have seen it in 2016, and if they don't get the message now, well, they're just going to have a whole lot of conflict and a whole lot of hurt because they are going to lose vote after vote after vote after vote. Then the questions are, what should they do? One option would obviously be consider moving to the Reformed Church of America and joining and affirming classis. I think there are a lot of reasons that many Christian Reformed churches won't want to do that. As Larry Lauder said about his church, they want to stay in the denomination. They may get kicked out. They may see that, in fact, the cost of staying in the denomination is too high because the kinds of people that they want to enfold, let's say gay and lesbian married families in Grand Rapids, won't want to come to their church because why deal with the fight? Maybe a slide will help. Losing war of attrition. The Christian Reformed Church has demonstrated that it has the votes and it has the will to pursue disciplining these churches. The votes on the Synod floor were unambiguous. That will is there, and the progressives have lined up with the conservatives. It's there. Second option, join the RCA. There has been talk, and I had Andrew Bianc on my channel, of a big switch where some traditional RCA churches join the CRC and some progressive CRCs join the RCA. I don't know if that will happen. Could be a possibility. I think their third option is split left, start their own denomination. To me, that would be, I think, the option that I would rather see them do. Livingstone's is not anywhere near close to being an affirming church. I'm not leaving the denomination to the left or the right. But I think that would actually probably be their best move. Why? Well, they can look for ways to collaborate. There remain tons of relationships between the moderates and CRC progressives. Look for ways to contribute to the conversation again and again. Now, all of you know my position. I think we should continue the conversation, and I think the conversation should continue both ways. I think part of the failure of the women in office decision was that we stopped the conversation, and we never continued to develop the conversation. I think having a confessional conversation is best when you have a diversity of opinions and you have a diversity of expressions. It's clear you can't have those within the Christian Reformed Church. It would be interesting to see where it would go in terms of something that at least began in the Christian Reformed Church and went a different way. that's the way they want to go. I'd be curious to see where it goes in 5, 10, 15 years. I'm not optimistic. I think it's fundamentally a reactive liberation from movement, but I'd be very curious to see what they could do with respect to confessions. And I think they would have to have honest and I think very interesting conversations in terms of, okay, what is your gospel? What does it look like? Is it, yeah. And I would love to watch those kinds of conversations and watch them do what they do and see where they go. Here's President Leroy's speech.
I see that President Leroy looks like he is asking for the privilege of the floor, so we're going to give that to him, and then I will look to you, Reverend Coy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for the chair of the committee, and one of the reasons that I have a question about this particular motion is that the CRC has not often said that something was always confessional. And so the question I have, since 1973, there has been a teaching of the church and a position of the Synod on human sexuality that people have followed, and in a subsequent decision of Synod suggested that people have ecclesiastical freedom to debate and discuss issues before the church. And since 73, there have been members, office bearers, that disagree with that perspective. We've heard members of this body describing some of those disagreements and disagreements with this motion. What I would like to understand from the chair of the committee is what occurs for people who are office bearers who have written in opposition to this, who have spoken in opposition to this, or who may live chaste lives now, but hold an opinion that is contrary to this decision. As I understand confessional matters, those would all be cause for church discipline. I would like to understand if I have a correct understanding of that and consider the implication for elders, deacons, pastors, and other office bearers of the church. And I would appreciate having an understanding, at least how does the committee see this? So thank you.
This is a question asked to the chair of the committee.
We definitely appreciate the difficulty that all of this discussion puts every single one of us in. And as we process that very question, we of course read the particular note that you had sent. I think a number of the faculty had sent as well. Where we came to on this is that we will make a decision here, and then we will turn to the church order to guide us through those next steps. And that is what we feel is the best answer we can offer at this point.
And of course, that is very much unknown territory. All right, so this was my speech. I have to direct this to the chair. But when I look around, I see a pretty morose, heavy bunch here. And I don't know that we should feel that way. On my little blog and my little channel, I've been asking for 10 years for confessional conversation. The conservatives were nervous about conversation. The progressives were nervous about confessional. Here we are. At this synod, we have a lot of confessional conversations to do. I find it really hard to imagine that question and answer 108, unchastity, wouldn't include the things on this list. It just looks that way. Now, it's a confession. Maybe it's not the confession for you, but you grew up in this church. These are your people. I regularly have these conversations, not only far afield from this denomination, but within this denomination. Had wonderful conversations with Clay Leibold, wonderful conversations with Len Vanderzee, the people on the All One Body page, the people on the Abide page, my good friend and pastor Dave Beelan. I love the spirit of the Minority Report because let's keep talking. I'm ready to keep talking. But we need to have confessional conversations. We have at least two deeply divergent approaches to Scripture in this denomination, and increasingly divergent visions of what Christianity and the gospel means. That's part of what happens in the church over very long periods of time. And since the Protestant Reformation, we've been using confessions to try to talk to one another in a productive way. What we're doing tonight is hopefully productive. I think it is. So it is historic. It is hard. There are people on the line, but we will get through this. And I hope we can be creative and find ways so that we can express this with each other. We will take votes. Lines will be drawn. People will be on either sides of it. But let's keep talking. Let's keep praying. Let's keep trying. Let's keep working. So it doesn't seem to me that there are many other options. They can't keep doing what they're doing. They're going to face a losing war of attrition. The timelines that they imagined are simply not there. The church will likely continue to get more conservative, not less. Pressure on them will grow. Increasingly, they will not be able to get jobs, at least if they are honest about their confession. And I think most of them would be, because this is a matter of pride. It's a matter of declaration of faith, and they're simply not going to fit. RCA might be a place for them. RCA has its own tradition. Start their own denomination, or start their own faction, or get creative with structure. I don't think that there's going to be a place within the structure as currently conceived in the Christian Reformed Church for them. Those are the consequences of this. I would like to find a way to continue to be in dialogue with my friends and colleagues and people I went to school with. We might not be in the same denomination, but I think the conversations can be especially productive because it will be interesting to see the trajectories in which they go. And so, I think these are the options, and it will be interesting to see what happens.